I've seen what love looks like, I've seen its beauty when it's alive.
All right, keyframe number 6. This one actually came out pretty clear and easy. Every once in a while you have a drawing like that that just flows down onto the paper. I think I knew exactly what I wanted for this one. It was always clear in my head, even before I'd written the story, that I wanted something like this. He's gone down to the river again, having built almost all of his new robot wife. And he's in a state again because he doesn't know whether he should give her free will or not. Human beings always have the fine line between free will and control. And where do you draw that line? Is the thing you love still what you love if you don't give it complete free will? So he's gone to ask his mentor again for advice. The thing that we've set up earlier, I think, in the story, or will at least set up earlier, is that there is the feeling of another presence down by this bridge. So the bridge has to have a dark space underneath, and something's in there, he thinks. But he's checked many times, and so he's really begun to think of it as just the troll under the bridge, and it's another one of those crazy people in his head that, you know, he imagines. So it's really important in this composition to have your eye go to the space. Here I try at first having his head turned, looking in that direction, but that was too obvious. So I will get rid of this in a second. But notice that little white space that he's turned towards. That's actually the most important part of this whole composition. That's where I want your eye to go. And the bridge itself, I also knew what kind of bridge I wanted. I wanted it to be iconic, not your typical bridge, something special. And in Victoria, when I was growing up, and all the way until just very recently, there was something we called the Old Blue Bridge. And for me, it always looked like some sort of giant horse with its head bowed down, trudging along across the bridge itself. And so I went and did some research and got some photographs of that because the bridge is no longer. And I was also lucky enough a while back to buy a balsa wood model of this thing so that I could always have a copy here in the studio. Just, I love it. It's such an amazing shape. So, I know what that bridge is like, and I was able to block it in very quickly there behind him and use that as a framing device for that little dark space. And then realized, as you see here, I've turned his head away, because that presence becomes a lot more powerful and possibly a little sinister if he's not looking at it. If instead it's looking at him, and maybe there's something in his attitude or his face that lets you know he senses it, but he's not going to turn and have a look again because he knows it's not real, but it might be, so he's not completely at ease. And the moment I got that dynamic going on, it was very easy to come in and sketch this face here, because I knew what was going on inside his head. He's struggling out of that very well-used by now lab coat, so he can take his clothes off again and go down into the water. And yeah, he has this feeling that maybe something is watching him, but by now he doesn't really care. He's in full mad scientist mode. I love that something can be there looking away and yet still connected to something behind like that. Growing up, there was a set of covers that James Bama did for a character called Doc Savage. And Doc would always be in the foreground with his torn shirt and so on. And there'd be something behind him, looming up giant. Maybe that's where I got a lot of these looming giant faces from. But I loved these things as a kid, and you'd have a looming monster or a giant sinister face or something happening behind him. And rather than having Doc turn and always seeing the back of his head, he was very good at drawing Doc Savage in the foreground and then just a twist to his head so that you knew he had just heard or just become aware or was just thinking of the thing that's back there. So I'm using the same technique here. And now that I've got the face where I need it to be, I've got the pose where I need it to be, and I've got the frame where it needs to go, the rest comes together pretty quickly. I've now finally put in the dark space behind him, the thing that's really important. If I had moved him over, the composition would be too balanced, and your eye wouldn't be seeking for the thing that's supposed to be on that first third of the picture. I don't know if you know that system, but very often we divide things up by thirds across a picture plane, and a thirds this way too. And where those points, where those cross, those are often focal points for an eye. You want to try and put things there that are important, that are storytelling moments. And there's other systems, and there's other ways to lead an eye across a picture. Pointing is one. Making it the biggest area of contrast is a huge one. In fact, the tools in the tool belt is really to know how to take the viewer across a picture plane in a particular order so that you can tell a story as their eye moves across the frame. One device I'm using now is the bridge itself. And I knew that when I chose this bridge. It has all these wonderful cross beams and uprights and all the rest. But look at the one I just put in there. It's actually pointing directly down towards Pig, and also that dark spot that I want you to look into. So everything really at any stage, even after you've designed a place, but definitely here when you're coming up with your keyframes and storytelling moments, you want it all to be about storytelling and about leading that eye where it needs to go in the order it needs to go. So I'm using my big blue bridge as a device, and I'll highlight and emphasize the beams that point down to where I want you to look, and make the others a little more subdued. Remember too that it's cold. A whole year has passed now. We saw him in the winter and diving into the frozen ice the first time, and it's happening again now. So maybe something to indicate that the weather is getting frosty again. So by the end of the story, once again, there's snow everywhere, and he's back where he began. Notice also still working in that much higher register, so that it's a narrower and lighter band of tones, which allows me to see the pattern of light and dark a lot easier than if my range was bigger. I will turn it dark at the very end, of course. And also now, here's another little puzzle piece to the world that he lives in. It's in a near future or an alternative future. There's something about this place that shows you that it has a history, it has a culture, it's upper, lower class, it's well taken care of, it's not well taken care of, it's all kinds of things that you can do with the architecture and the landscape that you see around you. He's on some sort of slope going down in towards that river, and you can see that river in the background, and through the little hole you could probably see a little edge of the city. That's always a good idea when you're doing environments, unless you want that claustrophobic feeling, to give it some depth by finding a little window that you can push the eye through and see into the far distance. So I've got a really nice bridge, but down at the base of it, it's got things that have been tacked on, maybe the remnants of shelter that somebody built down there. Again, haven't figured out much about either the city or so on, but I think one of the great clues we have of the people who live in a place is what kind of marks they leave behind, right? Well, from the signs that people put up and pay for and part of a big establishment, to the marks, the graffiti, the things that ordinary people add to their environment to make it a little bit of their own. Notice in that city in the distance now, I've gone back and added some of those high railings that would take the hover cars and the hover trains and all the rest, just to keep it consistent. It's important for characters and environments and everything else in your pictures to have something that's an emblem of that particular character. It can be their shape. It can be a particular coat they're wearing. He's taking off his lab coat here, so we know it's him. Actually, the emblem for Pig ended up being his crazy hair. You know, he's a mad scientist. So I wanted something about him to be a little unruly and unkempt. So I gave him that wilder hair. But for the city, it's those flying rails. You know, some very tall buildings and things, but not skyscrapers. And those big air rails going up to the air, which of course the Blue Bridge echoes really nicely there. Most important and tiniest of all in the picture is look into the shadow area that is the whole focus of this picture now. And you can see that there's two little dots, which may or may not be eyes that are watching him. That may clue you into his mental state of knowing something's there, but kind of ignoring it, but kind of not at the same time too. And I think I'm going to add some graffiti though to that bridge, so that we know that there's other things that have happened in this world up there. Putting a little bit of snow up in the sky too often helps. One of the things that gives a lot of depth is overlapping shapes. All right, so he's overlapping the bridge, and I've got snow coming down, overlapping, that shape and his shape, and binding that together. I do have reference, by the way. I went out and I sketched the underside of the new and the old bridges over the years, and so I can understand a little more of the construction. It's fantasy, though. The underside of the walkway bridge there, the part that comes forward, people either walk or cars go, needs some sort of structure underneath it to really truly hold it up. I don't have that handy, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. But eventually, to take this through to a final keyframe painting, I would go and I would do my research to understand how that is constructed and what actually holds it up. But if it's good enough to tell my story moment for now, I will leave it as it is. So instinctively, I drew in a giant gorilla monster, King Kong kind of thing onto the wall here. I realized afterwards it's a sort of monster. It's a sort of monster symbol that hints at the troll under the bridge. In some ways, it's a reminder of what he thinks is in there. But I liked it because it really added another source of interest on the other side of that dark space, so that your eye is constantly ping-ponging back and forth between those two, and in the middle, every time, those two little white dots that may or may not be a pair of eyes will always snare you every time you go there. And I think we're pretty good on this one. Now I'm going to alter my tones, bring it up to a range that I want. The dark space underneath has to go very dark, and I may even have to go back and repaint some of that so it's as dark as it can be. But there we are. That with the blue tone on top to bind it to the others, and keyframe number 6.